Hello beautiful friends, welcome to my channel. I'm really glad you're here. Today's video will explore insecurity and fear, what it costs us, what it costs others, and how we can better address our fears and insecurities to find more stability within ourselves and in turn listen more deeply and compassionately to others. And at the end of this video, I'll leave you with a meditative phrase you can connect to your breath to help ground you in moments where you feel particularly insecure. So, when we are listening to voices of fear and insecurity, it is near impossible for us to keep a steady awareness of how we're actually doing, much less to listen clearly to the realities and needs of those around us. Fear and insecurity promote self-interest, but not a healthy kind of self-interest, which might lead us to a more balanced understanding of our place in the world, but an unhealthy kind of self-interest that drives us to hold the world at arm's reach, to keep our defenses raised, believing either that we are unworthy of love and intimate relationship, or that if we open ourselves up to others, that we will face danger ourselves. I'm not advocating for a kind of aimless, self-absorbed navel-gazing, but a deep and compassionate look into ourselves, an investigation of those forces that make us want to turn away or disengage when we are confronted with grief or pain. Either the grief and pain of our own lives or that of the lives around us. And this kind of work, learning to be present with difficult emotions, is far from navel-gazing. Confronting our insecurities and fears to hold space for grief and pain is necessary work that each of us must engage in, not only for the sake of our own wellness, but so that we can find a life beyond our own discomfort and fear, and instead listen more closely and compassionately to the needs of all members of our community and our world. I believe that this process is necessary for all of us, but I also believe it looks differently for all of us, and I do not want to speak on behalf of anyone else's experience, so today I will share with you all some of my own. So when I was in the 8th grade, I told all my friends that I was so convinced that being gay was a choice that if I ever chose to be gay, they could shoot me. And then I would go home and watch gay porn and feel immense shame and self-disgust. Because I was deeply evangelical throughout grade school, I was convinced that my sexuality put me in danger of the fires of hell. So I overcompensated for my self-perceived sin by projecting the image that I was God's gift to humanity. For instance, in 9th grade, there was this introverted kid who, in hindsight, I really believe just wanted some space, or at most, some silent company. But I interpreted his self-isolation as something to be pitied and forcibly had lunch with him every day, bombarding him with stories from the Bible despite his obvious lack of interest. And my investment in him was actually just a distraction from myself. I didn't learn his name or any details about his life. That is, my interest in him was not actually an interest in what was going on in his life, but was instead just a space for me to feel better about myself. As another example of overcompensation, a few years later, I committed to reading the Bible in 90 days. So I'd wake up at 4 a.m. and binge read scripture instead of sleeping. This practice was hailed as aspirational by many of the adults around me, even though my mental health was suffering from a lack of sleep and a growing mountain of desperation and shame. And shame-driven actions of homophobic compensation abounded as well. I was vocally anti-queer and used the word gay as a derogative until my best friend articulated to me that he was offended by it. Unsurprisingly, that interaction was one of the most pivotal to me finding the courage to come out, because it was one of the first times anyone had challenged my homophobia. One of the first times that someone was willing to deem queer people as worthy of loving kindness, even if I was not. Until that point, growing up as an evangelical in Texas, no one really contested that mocking someone's gender or sexuality might be an inappropriate thing to do regardless of your religious or political feelings on the matter. So my feelings of fear and insecurity forced me, like so many other queer people, to just repeat the hatred, to expand it in new directions for fear that failing to participate in the social project of queer hating might cast suspicion onto me. This is not an uncommon cycle. A lot of the most aggressive anti-queerness that I have experienced has come from other people who would later come out as queer themselves. And it would be laughably predictable if it weren't so tragic how many religious leaders and government officials who posture as deeply conservative and anti-queer are later revealed to have been engaging privately in queer sex or queer self-expression. These people are also casting hatred onto others as a result of fear and insecurity. And the complication of our task is that we must insist on accountability for hateful and discriminatory actions regardless of their motivation, while continuing to recognize that ideas of justification or blame are not the point. We must move beyond thinking about ourselves or one another as good or bad people, and must recognize that we are all just people. People who are capable of engaging in acts of love and kindness, as well as acts of ignorance and hate and injustice. This is why it is so important that we establish a healthier relationship with ourselves, with our motivations as well as the consequences of our actions. Both are important and both are in need of healing. And speaking personally, it is deeply tragic to reflect on how many rich queer friendships I might have had growing up were it not for the cycle of shame, self-hatred, and othering. But now, it's Pride Month, and I have a lot of ambivalent feelings about Pride, about this idea that it gets better, which is a pretty privileged conception of the queer experience. While I do believe that holding space for yourself to move past internalized self-hatred is one of the only ways to find substantive healing, I also believe that no one is entitled to knowing anything about your sexuality or gender before you are willing to share it. And sometimes increased visibility only increases personal danger. As more Americans seem to be exposed to trans people than ever before, but trans women of color and Black trans women are dying at higher rates every year, and very few people seem to care. The uncomfortable truth is that sometimes the things we need for our collective political futures are different than the things we need for our personal safety. And sometimes things get worse before they get better. Our relationship to our queerness, to what a queer life means or looks like, is up to us to decide. And part of being proud of being queer means that as long as your actions are not harming others, it is entirely up to you how you choose to express yourself or who you choose to share certain pieces of yourself with. Sometimes choosing not to engage with someone who has proven themselves unsafe can reflect a greater sense of self-pride than feeling pressured to share a vulnerable part of yourself with people whose actions have demonstrated that they are incapable of safely holding your vulnerability. In this way, pride in our queerness or in any part of our lives is not about falsely asserting that we have magically moved from internalized shame and insecurity, come out of the closet and stepped into the light of perfect self-acceptance, but rather is about consistently refuting the harm and judgment that our bodies and minds are subject to as a result of being queer. To name that the exclusion, fear, and othering that we experience is unjust and toxic, and that we are committed to combating it with truth, love, and whatever other tools we might need. Unfortunately, there are a lot of people whose hearts and minds we cannot change, but we can always more closely consider our own. And an important part of Pride for me is addressing that almost no one said or did as many homophobic or transphobic things to me as I did, as I still sometimes do. I'm not saying this to promote further feelings of personal guilt or shame. This is not about blaming. I do not hold myself accountable for failing to find ways to be more kind to myself. After all, the only social depictions I was given for queer and trans people reflected that they were sinners, evil, child molesters, a joke, worthy of whatever harm came their way. And these systems of homophobia and transphobia existed long before I was born. But as I began to notice these systems of hatred were inscribed on my body, as I saw these patterns for what they were, it was easy to pretend as if I could flip a switch on my insecurity, to suddenly shift from a posture of self-deprecation to one of self-acceptance and pride. But this shift was mostly pretend. I would proudly proclaim at pride parades and on social media about how proud I was to be myself, how okay it was for me to be queer, but internally, I was avoiding the harder work of actually addressing the patterns of self-hatred that had been reinforced my whole life. I had yet to apologize to myself for the hateful things I had said and done. I distanced myself from people who failed to support me, but I didn't give myself the space to make amends for the ways in which I repeated these patterns and thus failed to support myself. And while I eliminated space for homophobia and transphobia in my interactions with others, I allowed the messages of shame and self-deprecation to continue playing on repeat in my mind. I do not believe I am alone in this. In fact, I think it is quite normal for people to internalize messages of self-hatred when they are consistently excluded and discriminated against for some aspect of their life that is beyond their control. This is what I mean when I say that we can only be as healthy as the environments in which we find ourselves. And because these factors of othering, race, gender, sexuality, etc., are socially constructed, the consequences of that discrimination affect all of us. They do not affect all of us equally at all. And this is why we need accountability and protection as well as healing and reconciliation. Harmful actions and words have to be stopped before we can even create enough space to safely engage in the work of healing. But while we are still striving for this at a collective level, we can find it on a more individual one. We can hold space for ourselves, to apologize to ourselves, to one another, not for the sake of pointing fingers or assigning blame, but simply to recognize that we are emotionally injured, that we have participated in injuring ourselves, and then to give our wounds air to breathe when we find the company of others who are invested in the same work, who are also trying to undo their insecurities and self-hatred. But I think we must be honest with ourselves about the difficulty and longevity of this process. While I am much more kind to myself than I ever was when I was in the closet, being earnestly proud of who I am is sometimes still more of an aspiration than a reality. And I really believe that's okay. So, as promised, I'll leave you with a meditative phrase to connect to your breath for those moments when you're feeling the weight of insecurity, of self-inflicted wounds. And it goes like this. So on the inhale, think to yourself, the more I love myself. And on the exhale, the more love I can share. The more I love myself, the more love I can share. The more I love myself, the more love I can share. If you're feeling brave and vulnerable enough to share any response you had to today's reflection, I would love to hear from you in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video or it meant something to you, please like and subscribe. Your support means a great deal to me as I want to provide reflections which speak to you. And thank you for watching. I wish you peace and perspective. I love you all as I love myself, as we are part of the same world. And I look forward to talking with you again soon.